Welcome to the 231st webinar of CACOR Live. I am Ruben Nelson, your host for the day. This has become the finest weekly webinar produced in Canada. If what you're after is a depth of understanding and an understanding of the complexity of the mess that we are in, how to understand it, and what we might do about it. Today, it's my honor to introduce Dr. William E. Rees. He's known to his friends as Bill, and I'm happy to count myself among them. You will find in listening to him that Bill is wise. That is, nothing that is important to the point that he's making has been left out. He's an integral thinker. That means the different aspects that he touches on are held together in a systematic way, and when you put weight on them, they become more coherent. Unlike most modern people, Bill is reflexive. If you listen to some of his personal stories, he'll tell you how that has got him into trouble. It tends to in a culture that is not reflexive. But Bill has developed a remarkable capacity to question not just others, but himself. And he's courageous. When first appointed to UBC, he was drawn aside and told, in effect, young man, if you keep thinking about the kinds of things you've just presented here, you may not last at UBC. And Bill found ways to both keep thinking the things that were his and to have a remarkable life at UBC. He's going to think with us today, not just the fact that we're in trouble, but explore why we're in trouble. Because if we don't understand the why, there's little chance that we'll be able to make any responses that are appropriate. And so the pattern will be that Bill will speak and we will listen. If you have questions, if you're listening live, if you have questions or comments, put them in the chat and we'll pick those up later. And now I'm happy to turn this over to Dr. William E. Rees. Bill, it is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ruben. After that introduction, I'm almost afraid to open my mouth. What we're going to see today is a kind of a ramble through the way I've been thinking about the current ecological predicament. And it's a bit of a jumble. It does cover a lot of ground. Ruben has accused me in the past of, I suppose, overkill, but we'll just see where it all takes us. So I'm really talking about the human obsolescent brain. And I'm going to put this in the context of our economic thinking, climate change, and what I see as a real ecological problem, overshoot. I'm really inspired in putting this together by something I learned a very long time ago by Alan Drengson, who was an important Canadian ecological philosopher. He was the editor for a time of a wonderful little magazine called The Trumpeter. I may have the wording slightly wrong here, but it was more or less infused in my brain this way. No amount of logical reasoning, legal argumentation, or ethical axiology will solve a problem that is misunderstood. Now, that's a profound statement because I submit that humans spend a huge amount of time attempting to solve problems that they just misunderstand. So for the sake of our argument today, let's consider this two-pronged problem. Modern techno-industrial society is in gross ecological overshoot. This means that we're basically destroying the biophysical basis of our own existence. So by definition, overshoot is a terminal condition. At the same time, we're experiencing the erosion of civil society in many countries, expanding regional conflicts and escalating geopolitical instability. And With all of this comes a withering capacity to respond effectively to either overshoot or the civilizational collapse that seems to be beginning around us. So there are two lenses. Well, there's many lenses, I suppose, but the two I've chosen to look at this problem are these ones. First, human exceptionalism. This is a belief with deep religious roots, rising, I suppose, out of the Enlightenment as well, that given our superior intelligence, our moral superiority, and the fact that we have a mortal soul, humans stand uniquely apart from the natural world. And this effectively means, according to this philosophy, that we are exempt from biophysical laws. Evolutionary history and humanity's genetic endowment have no bearing on how the future unfolds. And human motivations and behavior are wholly determined by social and cultural factors. The second lens is the lens that suggests humans are part of nature. And I take this from a core concept developed many years ago by the American-Russian geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky, who wrote famously in a paper and later in a book that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Now, I'm going to argue that human beings, Homo sapiens, like all known species, is a product of evolution by natural selection. Some of you may recoil at that, but that's where I start from. And if that's true, it follows from Dobzhansky that nothing in human affairs makes sense except in light of evolution. So my premise in all of this is that modern techno-industrial society perceives our ecological and social crises through the lens of human exceptionalism. And this is a gross error. But nevertheless, this is the approach to which through which we are taking our solutions, or at least the approach through which we are trying to find solutions to our problem. And I'm arguing in this presentation that we misunderstand the predicament entirely and therefore cannot solve the problem. By the way, there's a difference between problems and predicaments. A problem is something that has solutions. A predicament is something that only has outcomes. And so it's up in the air whether we're facing a problem with solutions or a predicament with which there's merely outcomes. So if we're a product of human nature, I think it's necessary, of natural selection rather, we have to really understand what that process involves. So all Darwinian natural selection is about is really quite simple. We need a large population of individuals that show variation in important structural and functional characteristics that are heritable. Some of these variations, differences in height, differences in intelligence, differences in verbal capacity, whatever, will be better adapted to prevailing environmental conditions. So those individuals with the superior variations will be selected by the environment. Those with inferior variations will be selected out. So the superior variation will survive and produce, the superior individuals will survive and produce more offspring. And that means that the responsible genes will accumulate in subsequent generations. So what the theory of natural selection says is that given adequate time, even the tiniest differences in heritable variability will be passed on and accumulate in subsequent generations. It may take millions of years. So there are some very important implications about this as far as human beings are concerned. The brain, indeed our entire central nervous system, has evolved in exactly the same manner as other organs and attributes of humanity. The capabilities of the brain, therefore, reflect the environments in which they evolved. Homo sapiens is a work in progress. People think we're at the pinnacle of evolution. We're not. We're still evolving, and we're still subject to natural selection. In fact, there's a good deal of evidence that in the past several thousand years, we're in a period of regression, but that's a whole other topic. So the modern human brain evolved when we lived in very small tribal groups in spatially limited, predictable environments. In a sense, then, the evolutionary history of the human brain is one that posed very minor challenges to the evolving nervous system. We have inherited, as techno-industrial peoples, what are basically paleolithic brains. Nothing has changed substantially in the last 50,000 years or so. And with those brains, we have a corresponding repertoire, a fixed repertoire of emotions, behavioral predispositions, and survival strategies. That means that like our MTI, or like our ancestors, we MTI persons tend to fixate on a single problem at a time, the economy, emissions, climate change, the pandemic, etc., and so on. We don't get complexity. By the way, when I say we, obviously I'm talking about in general. If like the mob, the crowd, some people do get these things in a minor sense. But on the whole, these, I think, are true statements. So we don't generally connect the dots among various environmental problems. That's why we don't get overshoot, which is the cause of all these other problems put together. So we also exhibit a marked aversion to rapid change because we evolved in simple environments that didn't change. We yearn for predictable stability. These qualities were perfectly adequate for survival tens of thousands of years ago. Here are some heritable behaviors that I think are dominating the way things are actually unfolding in the world today. First of all, we have a tendency, a subliminal tendency to expand into all accessible habitats. Human beings have the largest geographical range of any species on Earth, simply because we're much better at making habitats available to us through technology. We also have a tendency to consume essential resources to the limit of prevailing technology. If you want to get a good sense of this, read a little book called A Green History of the World. It's a marvelous story of how this tendency has prevailed over the last, at least, historical period. And in the case of humans, and I think this is really important to understand, accessible and available are continuously being redefined or upgraded by technological advances. Just to give you an example, think of oil. A few years ago, and I'll get to this later on, people talked about peak oil. We were supposed to essentially peak in oil production sometime in the late 80s or thereabouts. And after that, there'd be a steady decline. But nobody anticipated the impact of technology here. And we saw the development of fracking and an amazing increase in global oil supplies, largely in the United States in the last 20 years or so. But my point is that humans will use up all the economically accessible fossil fuel. And we don't know how that will play out because technology is continually redefining what we mean by technology and accessible in that context. And by the way, this trait is a common one. When other species learn to use technology, they do exactly the same thing. They overexploit their resources. So there's a famous study of tool-wielding monkeys with pushing local shellfish to extinction once they learn to open them by bashing them on rocks, for example. But human beings, again, are outliers here because with our more advanced technology, we're competitively superior to all ecologically similar species. And we have therefore displaced most of them from their ecological niches and food supplies as we've moved forward. There's a wonderful model of the brain. It's somewhat outdated. It's called the triune model by Paul MacLean. Paul argued that the human brain has evolved in large steps. We have something called the reptilian complex, or the old brain shared with most vertebrates. And this is the part of the brain that's concerned with physical survival or socially hardwired behaviors, fight or flight, for example. Instinct and rituals originate here. We also have a limbic system, or the paleomammalian or midbrain, which is the site of our emotions, food and sex, bonding and attachment, memory, and so on. But most especially in humans, we have the cerebrum, the cerebral hemispheres. This is the seat of logic and reason, forward planning and thinking, technical manipulation, language and speech, obviously better developed in humans than in any other organism. It occupies perhaps 2/3 of the human brain. But again, the point is we almost have 3 separate brains operating in union. They're very closely tied together. But the point is we often do not know which of these brains is in charge. So there's tension in the integrated mind. The brain is an integrated organ. We seem uniquely self-conscious and rational, and that's because we live in our cerebral consciousness. However, When anything from simple comfort to safety or survival is threatened, the behavioral predispositions and propensities that operate beneath consciousness in the midbrain and reptilian brain override our rational responses. And so it's well known that passion and instinct often trump reason. And by the way, this is highly evolutionarily advantageous. If you want a good look at it, check out a little book called Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio, one of the great contemporary neuroscientists. That's Descartes' Error. So free will, we don't know which subbrain is calling the shots. It's well known now that about 95% of human brain activity happens below conscious awareness. Even our important decisions that we think we've made are made before we actually become aware we've made them. There was a wonderful article by Dennis Overby in the New York Times way back in 2007. I think you can still find it online, but I took this line from it because it really describes decades of excellent work on the human brain and the relative importance of consciousness versus unconsciousness, or unconscious behavior, subconscious behavior. A bevy of experiments in recent years suggest that the conscious mind is like a monkey riding a tiger of subconscious decisions and actions in progress, frantically making up stories about being in control. So we like to think we're in control. The fact is we may not be. So we're not primarily rational. A rational decision is one arrived at through logical reasoning based on factual evidence. Think of what's happening in the United States as we proceed through this session today. Rational decision-making is influenced by, but should not be unduly distorted by, emotion. And by these criteria, human groups in particular are not remotely rational. A wonderful regular blogger is a guy called George Tsakraklides, I guess it is in Greek. I put a URL down at the bottom of the screen here. And he's recently had a number of, he's a microbiologist, by the way, but he's recently had a number of articles on the human brain. One of them was called The Next 10 Minutes is the Most Important in Your Life. And the point he was making is that for survival, right here and right now is much more important than 10 years or even 10 days from now. So he is arguing here that evolution shaped our brains to focus mainly on the next few minutes. And his question is, why plan for the future if you can't survive the next 10 minutes? In other words, surviving for the right now is the brain's main priority, finding food, shelter, avoiding predators and hostiles, and so on. Long-term planning, quote, takes a back seat. Those who can survive the next 10 minutes are much more likely to pass their genes on to the next generation. So the fight or flight response, for example, exists for a reason. Powerful hormonal injections enable us to take the quickest decisions, not necessarily the right decisions. So this fits very closely to my notion that our brains are products of the evolutionary context in which they evolved. Even economists recognize this quality in the concept of spatial and temporal discounting. In fact, human in general, and politicians in particular, are temporal, spatial, and social discounters. By this, we naturally favor the familiar, the here and now, and close relative and friends over uncertain futures and unknown people in foreign lands. We do this by nature. It's logical in evolutionary terms. And this is why decision makers would much rather risk imposing possible future damage on unborn peoples and on total strangers in distant countries than impose certain economic hardship on their own family, friends, and constituents. Think about how we deal with climate change. I think in the West, we generally expect most of the real damage to be done in distant lands to other peoples, and often this is an excuse for not changing our behaviors right now in order to protect them. We'd rather maintain our current economic context and course, okay? A very recent paper, I think just 2 or 3 weeks ago, came out called The Unbearable Slowness of Being. These neuroscientists have been measuring the rate at which humans think and comparing it to other, I suppose, information processing systems. And they found that the human brain, in the thoughtful portions, are capable of only about 10 bits per second. But by contrast, our sensory systems are gathering information at 1 billion bits per second. So what's that, 100 million times faster? Those are our instantaneous lower brain responses. But the upper brain, this big cerebral cortex, is processing information at only 10 bits per second. And this helps explain why we think in simplistic first-order terms, why we can in their terms. This is why we can only think about one thing at a time. And they ask, how can humans get away with just 10 bits per second? Cognition at such a slow rate was sufficient for survival. Again, the evolutionary context. Quote, most of the time, our evolutionary environment changed at a much more leisurely pace than even 10 bits per second. So there was simply no selective pressure on our thinking process to move beyond 10 bits per second. All our other motivations, the flight and flight, are instantaneous. We don't think about them at all. They process information at a much more rapid rate of speed. But the point again is that we're trapped in this evolutionary frame of our brains and are confronting a very different world today. So my argument has been that the brain's obsolete, and something becomes obsolete in one of two ways. A newer version of that entity comes along that is more efficient, more effective, or otherwise functionally superior to the original. Well, we're not about to get a newer version of our brains that is functionally superior to the ones that we already have. The second way we might become obsolete is that the entity, in this case, the brain, the operating environment changes so much that the brain is no longer able to function effectively and may actually become self-destructive. And by definition B, the human brain is obsolete. Modern techno-industrial humans have not evolved beyond the cognitive limits set by their paleolithic brains. And we don't even realize that we are trapped in this Darwinian sinkhole. Hence, we misdefine the problems we find ourselves in. One consequence is that people today are inherently maladapted to our present environment. So unlike our Paleolithic ancestors, MIT persons live in a mind-numbingly complex, rapidly changing world system of overlapping subsystems that we ourselves have created and that are constantly changing and challenging our limited cognitive capacities. We are not cognitively equipped to fully understand, let alone control, the workings of any major cultural subsystem. Nobody really understands the global economy. Nobody controls the internet. Artificial intelligence is becoming a major problem. Geopolitics is completely out of hand now. And we don't understand the interactions among any of these systems that we don't understand, the climate system or any biophysical subsystem of the ecosphere. Again, then, we don't. In fact, we cannot, because of our cognitive limitations, fully connect the dots. We do not get the system we are operating in. So in effect, with our functionally obsolete brains, we are no longer adapted for survival in a megasystem of our own making. Ruben likes to talk about the mess of messes we have got ourselves into, and that's exactly the situation I'm describing here in somewhat different language. We're falling behind. Richard Dawkins, a famous geneticist, invented the concept of memes. Memes are nuggets of cultural information, such as ideas and technologies. And a meme can be instantly shared among members of the same generation. Significant change can happen in days or months, and we see that every single day. Genes, on the other hand, are nuggets of biological information that can be passed only between sequential generations. Significant change takes many generations and thousands of years in the case of humans because our generation time is so very long. And this means that memetic evolution, the evolution of technology and cultural ideas, is much faster than genetic evolution. And our cultural evolution has vastly outpaced our biological evolution. So we have an example of two information processing devices here. Rapidly evolving memetic hardware compared to our slowly evolving, even regressing genetic wetware. So again, I will emphasize that modern humans are arguably cognitively impaired for life in today's world. We're obsolete. There's a biocultural factor then that comes into this. And as I said at the outset, I want to illustrate this through both economics and the climate conundrum. So reality is an odd concept. It's not what humans generally think it is. We socially construct our lived realities, or socially construct what I would call shared delusions. Sociologists refer to the social construction of reality. I would argue that it's really shared delusions. Human groups create simplified interpretations of reality, such as political ideologies, our religious doctrines, economic paradigms, scientific models, cultural narratives. All of these things are products of the human mind. We birth them in language. We manipulate them through subsequent discourse and discussion, conflicts in the literature, and so on and so forth. But eventually, these ideas are raised to the level of received wisdom, and at which point they become accepted doctrine. Every culture or tribe generates somewhat unique perceptions, which its citizens, often unconsciously again, assume to be the one and true reality. And in an earlier presentation, I made the point that at this point, they actually form synaptic networks in the brain. They become physically present so that any particular symbol of that idea will trigger the whole synaptic network to the great delight of the individual possessing that idea. Well, this matters a great deal because the constructed frameworks through which we view reality determine the kind of reality we perceive. I think Ruben is confident of that concept as well. But there's a problem, of course, in that people live out of their constructed realities. And again, keep in mind, this includes everything from tribal myths to political ideologies, as if they were real. And sometimes they are harmless. The idea that the Earth is flat is completely inaccurate, but was an adequate first approximation of reality for most of human evolutionary history. So we can live out of completely erroneous beliefs and concepts, and it doesn't matter. But sometimes our constructed delusions are potentially catastrophic. And again, I would argue that given our human exceptionalist perspective, modern techno-industrial culture has been living out of a nearly universal, complex, yet overly simplistic mythic construct called neoliberal economics. And as I said, this reflects our post-Enlightenment human exceptionalism. It sees humans as apart from nature. And because it does so, our economic models are virtually untethered from biophysical reality. This is the classic model from any economics textbook. It's a starting point for economic analysis. It shows the economy as a self-perpetuating, self-generating circular flow of money values. It omits any biophysical environment, any spatial and social communities, family, personal relationships, etc. In other words, it omits almost everything that's really important to human existence. And for that reason, it can neither predict nor prescribe for ecological or social problems. And when glitches do occur, which they're bound to, given the unreality of the model, we file them under the quaint concept of externalities. So the environment becomes an externality. It's outside of the norm of consideration in economics. No, this is a flight of fantasy, obviously. Economic activities, any sensible person would recognize, if you think about it for a moment, are what humans do to exploit the biophysical environment and what we do to allocate extracted resources essential for life. And yet our neoliberal economics views the economy and the ecosphere as entirely separate, independent systems. You really have to ask when you think about it, how stupid is that? It assumes that any residual resource constraints or pollution will be overcome by human ingenuity. This is the technological factor. Many famous economists subscribe to the idea that human ingenuity, human inventiveness, is the greatest resource. So through continuous efficiency gains and technological advances, we can overcome any residual problem the environment throws at us. And if you think about it, just these two beliefs alone, inscribed in our synaptic circuits, are sufficient to cement belief in unlimited economic growth. There's a related material fantasy. I find this rather fascinating. Because the fallacy of separate and independent is failing, we're seeing all sorts of examples of pollution that are very serious. Climate change is one of them, for example. So now the economists and other techno-optimists fantasize that the economy is decoupling from the environment, that the economy is dematerializing. And this fantasy is based on, again, very limited, simplistic, faulty accounting. The reality is that, of course, there's some relative decoupling. So when resource consumption and pollution increases slower than growth in domestic product, that's fair enough. But absolute decoupling is rare, and total decoupling is not even theoretically possible. In fact, I have to emphasize here that humans, well, maybe I won't go on too many side tracks. Okay, so I will give you one very serious example. It's a paper published just a couple of weeks ago. I've given the URL partway down there. It's Thomas Pueyo's regular blog. He's a Dutch engineer. And I call his recent, I suppose, output his Dutch delusion. And what he's arguing is that, look, Holland is one of the most densely populated countries on the planet. There's 18 million people living on 33,000 square kilometers. So there's a population density of 545,000 people square kilometers. And yet, and this is a quote from this paper, the Netherlands is nice. Not only that, the Netherlands is a top food exporter. And he then takes this to argue that at a similar population density, the world could easily support 70 billion people. And that doesn't even count such technological advances as so-called vertical farming. So with vertical farming, and again, I'm almost quoting him, well, I am quoting, many more than 100 billion people could be supported by the planet, and it would be a better place. Okay, now here's a graph taken directly from his little article. It shows the Netherlands as the second largest food exporter in the world after the United States. Actually, if you I checked this out and looked at a number of other sources, they would place it at fourth or fifth, but it doesn't really matter. They're using the wrong metric. You'll notice that top agricultural exporters, because we are an economic species, is measured in dollar terms. Well, if you turn this around and think about it a little bit, we don't eat dollars. The Netherlands is not importing more dollars than it's exporting. What it is importing is vast quantities of fodder from various countries around the world to feed its animal and poultry population. So it's a net exporter in monetary terms only. If you add material flows, the fodder to feed the domestic livestock and poultry, the Netherlands could not even support its own population on its domestic land base. The Dutch people don't live in Holland in ecological terms. They live on several times as much land effectively imported through material trade from elsewhere. So measuring this in monetary terms gives a completely incorrect and false impression. And again, it derives from misunderstanding the nature of the problem by being deluded by our social construct, in this case, neoliberal economics. Here's a little look at the biophysical reality of it from another wonderful paper you can still download from the internet. Fowler and Hobbes' little paper on Is Humanity Sustainable? And what they did was to look at about 195 maybe other species of animals that are similar in their demands on the environment to humans. And we compared humans to them using a dozen or so different metrics. And what they found is that human beings were 1 to 2 orders of magnitude outside of the 95% confidence limits for these other 95 species. So here's just the graphics for consumption from the biosphere. You can see all the other species in a near normal distribution, and humans are the outlier outside, so that our ingestion of biomass, the amount of stuff we eat, is 95%, is 2 orders of magnitude outside the 95% confidence limits among non-human mammals. We take 100 times more than our closest competitors. It's just an astonishing reality that makes human beings the single most important consumer species in all the ecosystems on planet Earth. Now, I say again, we've known this for decades, but you can lead a human to knowledge, but you can't make him think, if not if you're Thomas Pueyo, hooked on the monetary exchange. Okay, let's look at global heating as another example of how we've misinterpreted the problem. And just to be clear, I'm not saying global warming isn't a huge problem. This is a huge problem. Let me say it as clearly as I can. The problem is the way we are approaching it is making it worse. So the bottom line in terms of the problem is that the 1.5 degree Celsius warming limit is in the rearview mirror. In fact, just yesterday, James Hansen and his group published a paper saying that probably we're well beyond saving ourselves at 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And we're on track for 3 degrees of mean global warming, which is climate chaos later on in this century. So it's a huge challenge. I'm not saying that for a moment that it is not. But the way we've been approaching it produces this curve. We've had something like 55 years of climate change warnings. We've had 29 COP conferences now, the most recent just a couple of months ago in Azerbaijan. Over that period of time, we have seen a steady increase. All of these conferences and meetings and agreements have been oriented toward reducing human use of fossil fuels and therefore carbon emissions. But over this entire period, there's been a steady, in fact, accelerating, it's almost an exponential, a slow exponential increase in carbon emissions. So that by November, we were 423 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is 51% above pre-industrial levels. By the way, this curve I've taken from the NOAA, the United States National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, which is shut down. This morning, I went to try to upgrade this chart, not this morning, yesterday morning, and found that the website has been shut down by the new Trump administration. They're denying climate change and preventing any of their government organizations from making reference to it. And of course, this site, the global, what was it called? The Global Monitoring Laboratory out of Hawaii, has been priceless for those of us who follow these trends, and now they're denied to us. The site has been shut down, at least temporarily. We'll see where that goes. Anyway, how can this be? How is it that the problem is extreme? We've recognized it for 50 years. We've held countless meetings, all oriented toward reducing emissions, and they failed miserably to reduce emissions. In fact, today, we're using more fossil fuels than ever before in history, and carbon emissions are at a higher rate than ever before in history. Politically acceptable solutions are from the exceptionalist mode. They reflect the 10-minute brain. So they're coming from one mode while operating from the other mode, which is the single-minded, growth-oriented, short-term goals of capitalist economists. So isn't it ironic that while we think of ourselves as exceptionalists, the solutions are emerging handicapped by our 10-minute brain, so that approved solutions include any capital-intensive investment, wind, solar power, EVs, non-existent carbon capture technologies, geoengineering, and so on. These are all techno fixes which maintain the status quo. To quote Clive Spash, a very well-known British ecological economist, disaster policy is being designed to serve the capitalist growth-based economy so that the latter becomes the solution to and not the cause of the problem. In other words, climate change has become a distraction from acknowledging and responding to the real predicament, which is human ecological overshoot. So we're really engaged in a process of trying to maintain the status quo through business as usual by alternative means, in this case, alternative being a different fuel source. So we've agreed to replace the coal-powered engines of our global economic Titanic with electric motors. Wonderful little book by William Ophuls called Electrifying the Titanic, which means we're ignoring the real problem, which is the icebergs. The Titanic would have sank just as quickly electrified as it did with its coal-powered power plants. And in any case, any reasonable thinking person understanding the concept of overshoot would realize that the quantitative replacement of fossil fuels would merely perpetuate overshoot, and the continued degradation of the ecosphere. Meanwhile, the world denies the obvious, which is our continuing addiction to fossil fuels. This is a graph just published this week by Arthur Berman, but it shows something I think most people are completely ignorant of, that the growth in conventional and unconventional oil, but particularly unconventional oil, is the major source of new energy on the planet today. The renewable energy delusion is just that. Despite the hype, there is no energy transition. Fossil fuels remain dominant. New energy sources are additive. The modern world uses more conventional biomass, wood, peat, animal dung today than it did way back in 1800. And you can see that's the lowest portion of this graph, the gray bit. But the main point is that despite everything we've heard about the massive increase in wind and solar power and how they're getting cheaper and cheaper and displacing fossil fuel, it's simply untrue. The US oil shales have been growing much faster than global disposition of wind and solar power. And the main point of this graph is to show that every new energy source simply adds to what we had before. And therefore, under the completely inappropriate and impossible continuous growth phenomenon, we increase our capacity to deplete the atmosphere. So what I'm arguing at bottom here is that there's just so much momentum in our MTI mentality and the kind of society that it has created. We've gone beyond having a problem that might have had a solution to being victims of a predicament that puts us in what I call the quintessential rock in a hard place. We have two options. You've all heard the motto, stop fossil fuels. But if we rapidly stopped fossil fuels, and again, I must go back to the previous slide, we are almost utterly dependent on fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas to operate our economy. It's still about 81% of primary energy. Nuclear will grow as well. Hydro is practically burned out, but or at least we filled all the available sites. But if we rapidly stop fossil fuels in these circumstances to avoid disastrous climate change, in the absence of any quantitatively adequate substitute, which, as I say, we do not have, then we risk, and I think subliminally people recognize this, increasingly so. We have inadequate energy supplies, which means broken supply lines, food and other resource shortages, local famines, reduced production, declining incomes, rising inequality, widespread unemployment, civil unrest, abandoned cities, mass migrations, collapsed economies, and increasing geopolitical chaos. And by the way, I think many of those things are already beginning to happen. And by the way, we'd still suffer ongoing climate change because of the longevity of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Bottom line, rapidly stopping fossil fuels risks the well-being and lives of billions. Well, what's the option? Well, the option is our current default position, which is to remain largely dependent on fossil fuels. We are not reducing our consumption of fossil fuels. We're doing this to maintain the growth paradigm, and will continue to do so because we have this predisposition to use up all available resources as long as supplies last. But in doing so, we risk more and longer heat waves. We're headed toward 3 degrees minimal. Extended drought, desertification, melting permafrost, methane releases, which is a positive feedback effect, water shortages, resource shortages, failing agriculture, famines, rising sea levels, flooding and eventual loss of many coastal cities, some say within 50 years, uninhabitable regions and mass migrations. In other words, collapsed economies and geopolitical chaos. And by the way, we'd still run short of energy. And in the end, we risk the well-being and lives of billions. What's the difference between the two? Well, each of them leads us towards societal collapse. And it wouldn't be the first time. Most of you should be familiar with Joseph Tainter's little book, The Collapse of Complex Societies. What he says is, what is perhaps most intriguing in the evolution of human societies is the regularity with which the increasing complexity is interrupted by collapse. So Tainter views human societies as problem-solving entities. As we encounter a problem, say food shortages, we invent a solution, agriculture, and if that starts to fail, we invent another solution, irrigation and fertilization. But with each solution, we increase the population, increase the complexity of society, and we begin to experience diminishing returns. To quote, eventually continued investment in complexity as a problem-solving strategy yields a declining marginal return. Incomes stop rising, energy return on energy investment declines. We're into that, by the way. Corruption increases, social unrest prevails, social support systems begin to crumble, and so on. And increasingly radical attempts to save the system cannot permanently reverse the trend toward deep disequilibrium and collapse. And I submit that the alternative green energy strategy is one such increasingly radical attempt, because it actually vastly increases our destruction of the ecosphere. But the bottom line is that we're headed toward, and if you read this book, and then there's several others that make the same argument, most of the symptoms of incipient collapse are upon us. A corruption at the top, a disenchantment of the population, the debasement of the currencies, environmental problems, and so on and so forth. So what Tainter's really arguing is that we've reached a point of complexity. When the next big problem comes along, we're at such a level of diminishing returns and social disorder that we can't deal with it, and we implode. Our, I suppose, primitive brains are simply incapable of dealing with that next round of complexity in any significant way. Well, is that a realistic phenomenon? If you think about Tainter and then put it in the context of the limits to growth model, which predicted that the human system would implode in the middle of this century, there's been not a dozen, but at least 6 that I'm familiar with, studies of limits to growth since 1972, which show that the so-called standard run is what the world is actually following. The purple dots are the real world. The green line is the limits to growth model. And notice the purple dots are adhering pretty closely to the standard run scenario, which takes us in toward collapse by the middle part of this century. I think there's nothing unanticipated about that. Human beings are just like every other species. When introduced to a resource-rich habitat, this is what happens. Species expand exponentially, because the negative feedbacks of resource scarcity and disease and so on have been relieved. Here's the classic study of reindeer populations on the Pribilof Islands, completely uninhabited previously by reindeer, overrun by lichens. The reindeer populations expanded to the point where they denuded the islands and then collapsed ignominiously. Look at the first parts of these curves compared to the human population curve, and I'm arguing what goes up will come down. All species, humans included, are capable of exponential growth under favorable conditions. Fossil fuels are to humans what the lichens were to the reindeer. We've had a 200-year period of relief from scarcity, of improved public health, of reduced death rates, but this has led to this 200-year population explosion and a 100-fold increase in economic activity. 8-fold population, 100-fold increase in the economic activity on a world that has not only not gotten any bigger, it's getting smaller as we deplete it. So I'm arguing we're nearing the peak of a one-off population boom-bust cycle, just like any other species subject to the laws of natural selection. Some years ago, Richard Duncan and others talked about the peak oil, but Duncan came up with the Olduvai theory, suggesting that as we ran out of fossil fuels, he was thinking around now we would implode. He called this his Olduvai theory. We'd be headed back to the Stone Age. I think he was, because of his underestimation, as the economists would say, of the powers of technology, he, I suppose, missed by about 3 or 4 decades, but this will come. In fact, just this morning, I read a paper saying that peak oil is arriving, even in the shale oil, so that we can expect the down curve to start anytime soon. Nate Hagens, many of you will be familiar with Nate's series called Frankly. His, frankly, on 31st of January was about artificial intelligence. And I think it's another wonderful illustration of what I've been getting at here. Quote from Nate: "As we race towards superficial artificial intelligence, we face a species-level Icarus moment, where our technological ambitions outstrip our collective wisdom." In other words, where our technological advances outstrip our cognitive obsolescence. We're flying too close to the sun. AI could turbocharge the economic superorganism, accelerating its impact on resource extraction, ecosystem degradation, and human meaning, all while fragmenting our shared reality and concentrating power in dangerous ways. Well, that's Joseph Tainter writ large. How might society adapt? Nate asks, can we find ways to use the devil's tools in the service of Gaia's work? Or are we operating a Pandora's box that cannot be closed? Well, that's a good question, and yet we plunge on largely uncritical of AI. Again, it would seem today that man is in flight from thinking. Martin Heidegger said this in his discourse on thinking in 1955. He was talking about philosophical or meditative or contemplative thinking here, and also very critical of our rapid acceptance of new technologies, which have the effect of turning things over. So why do I bother with all this? And you'll be relieved to know this is my last slide. First of all, I think it's fascinating to just try to understand the nature of our unfolding reality. At present, and this is really a key point, I think, our socially constructed MTI cultural narrative based on human exceptionalism is actually reinforcing our natural expansionist tendencies on a finite planet. So we have a natural process of exponential growth being reinforced by an economic paradigm that assumes that it's the norm. I think this is not very bright. I harbor a faint hope that raising to consciousness that much of our social behavior is being nudged by the genetic whisperings within, the name of a book by David Barash, The Whisperings Within, wonderful book, by the way. This opens the possibility of self-awareness and asserting control, or a degree of it at any rate. Maybe I'm naive. Recognizing the bio-origins of certain innate tendencies at least raises the remote possibility at this stage, possibility of developing socio-cultural overrides. An override is simply something that prevents something else from happening. And I would argue that much of our so-called civilization, doesn't matter which civilization, exists as a set of laws, rules, and social norms that are explicitly designed to override such entirely natural behaviors as polygamy, theft, murder, and so on. So human beings weren't designed to live in our very large societies. I have a whole other presentation about this problem. But we do, and certain things emerge, such as theft and murder and so on, in a way that they do not in smaller societies. And we had to develop, as we got into big cultures, ways of overriding, preventing the law, okay? So I'm arguing, again, very tenuously, that if enough people were to see that our current MTI narrative debunked, if we were to see it debunked, then we might get to seriously thinking about trying viable alternatives. And again, the whole point of this discussion is that if we accept reality and begin to know ourselves as evolved entities in a world that we're no longer adapted to, these are the first steps towards a personal to civilizational transformation to an entirely new way of being. Thank you very much.
Allow me to invite us to a moment of just even 1 minute, which is unusual in our busy culture, of quiet meditation to absorb what Bill has said, so that we don't end up just modeling the 10-minute mind and reacting to what has been said, but actually think about it and digest it. There are some questions in the chat. I invite you to put others as the conversation develops. Bill, as you know, you will be thanked more formally, but I said earlier that I am honored to be the host when you speak, because it always sparks images and ideas and slim hopes that we may find a way out of this mess other than through utter disasters. Let me build on an observation and one of the points that you made. The observation is that you are, yes, you're a white privileged male in all kinds of ways, the way that those of us who are brighter than average white modern males have been privileged. And yet you don't show the set of normal modern techno-industrial male responses. And so, without putting you on a psychiatrist's couch, I want you to talk to us a little bit about how did you get this way? I mean, do you see things in your life? And in part, I ask it not just to pry into your life, but to provide clues about what a culture that became self-conscious might actually think about. What are the kinds of things that we might think about that we could reinforce in order to override the mindless expansion that's built into our modern techno-industrial society?
Wow, that's a big question. First of all, Ruben, thank you very much for taking on the role of host here. And I'm sure you recognized in some of my comments the results of discussions and arguments you and I have had about the state of affairs as we've got along. You've been an enormous influence on my own thinking. It's really hard to know where I'm coming from, but I think two events are particularly important as I reflect on this. The first is that I was extremely privileged as a very young child to have spent a great deal of time on my grandparents' farm in southern Ontario. There were 8 cousins. I'm 80 odd years old, so I grew up working on this farm in the late 40s and 50s. I'm privileged to have hand-loaded hay onto a horse-drawn wagon with a pitchfork. But the main thing that came out of my early farm experience was a profound sense of attachment to earth, a profound sense of living off of the land, quite literally. I mean, I sat in my grandmother's porch every day, marveling at the fact that everything on the plate that I was eating, this is our big summer porch where all the hired hands and kids came in to munch after a day in the field, I had a hand in growing. You know, the old concept of you are what you eat hit me as an 8-year-old, for God's sake. And by the way, this is the origin of ecological footprint analysis. So years later, when I was chided by an economist that human carrying capacity was a meaningless concept, I thought back to my days on the farm. He was arguing that technology and trade would relieve any local population of scarcity, and so no such thing as human carrying capacity. Well, that triggered me into thinking that's got to be nonsense. The second thing, and by the way, that's where ecological footprint analysis came into being. It was designed to show that there's no such thing as economic decoupling, that carrying capacity is alive and well. And what trade does is not increase carrying capacity, but simply shuffle it around. If one country has excess capacity, we can import it to another country that's exceeded its capacity. And that, by the way, is the Dutch example. My personal history of Holland is, way back in the 80s, the first country I analyzed with eco-footprint analysis was Holland. And I was invited by the Dutch government to a conference there on the marvels of Holland. And the speaker on the podium before me was another economist who argued that Holland was an example for the world to follow because with this huge population density, blah, blah, et cetera, and it had food export surplus. Well, I came up behind him and said, absolute nonsense. You're importing enough food that you'd need 3 times, 4 times as much agricultural land as you've got here, but you feed it all to animals and then export expensive meat and food. Meat and cheeses and so on. So you can afford to buy the cheap fodder to grow your agriculture. But the bottom line, that farm experience was absolutely foundational. The second foundational thing was finding out that I couldn't study human ecology in any zoology department, in any university in North America. I applied to 100 jobs. I finally got a couple, but I had to study small mammals or birds. I couldn't look at humans. Then this opportunity came along to develop a course in ecological planning at UBC. And what this did was throw me into a pot in which every day, I never met another ecologist. It was sociologists and economists and political scientists and all these other people who had completely different worldviews than my own. And for the first time in my life, I had a PhD, but I felt I was becoming educated by being exposed to this plethora of alternative viewpoints and points of view, none of which I could understand. So I had to start reading in all of these other disciplines and finally realized that we're all wrong to a certain degree, but if I patch together enough of the truth from each of them, I might get some kind of understanding of where we're going. So that's the big story, Ruben. Life on a farm, no kid gets it today, real tragedy, and then interdisciplinarity after having a solid foundation in something else. I think every student should be required to get a degree in basic social and historic literacy before going on to physics or chemistry or medicine or anything else. The humanities are grotesquely important, and yet they're withering on our techno-industrial vine.
Yeah. Thank you. That's extraordinary, and it's important because it reinforces one of the main points you're making, is that our normal ways of doing things is to leave us out of the equation as persons. And you've just said in your own story, as well as your comments on the humanities, that we must understand ourselves as persons, both unique persons and in groups, and our history, because if we don't get that, the odds of actually making sense of where we are slim. Ralph Martin, I should have given you a warning, but if you would open your mic and turn on your video. And Mike, Hanauer, Boston, you will be next, just as a heads up.
Okay. Thank you very much for this talk and for your work through the years. I've been following it since I was a student way back. Pleased to say that I also grew up on a farm, and my grandpa had a huge influence on me on that farm and has informed my thinking to today. My question is, how has your worldview changed regarding the probability of global civilizational collapse from, say, about 1975, 50 years ago, to 2000, 25 years ago, to now? Because I know my thinking has been shifting, and I'm assuming that you didn't arrive at your thinking, your 2025 thinking in 1975.
No, I certainly didn't. In 1975, I was working mostly on environmental assessment. The whole idea of environmental impact assessment had come out of the US Environmental Policy Act of 1972, I guess it was, and we were adopting it in Canada. So I took it on as very hopefully, as this would really going to help change how we make our decisions. Because for the first time, we were going to systematically assess the impact of developmental decisions on ecosystems. And what I found was that it had no effect whatsoever on the nature of our decisions, or very little. That in almost every case, some other factor, primarily economic factors, overturned the major environmental inputs. Sometimes I worked a lot in the north of Canada. There was a big effort to get social considerations into effect, but basically we bought off the First Nations people by offering them jobs in oil and gas development and so on and so forth. So I became very disenchanted with the role of science through my active engagement in trying to get it applied in very particular contexts, particularly environmental assessment. So to make a long story short, Martin, is it right, sir? Martin?
Ralph.
Ralph.
Ralph Martin, yeah.
I started out, thinking that we needed better information. It's the old, every scientist thinks that better information leads to better decision. It doesn't. So I began to think that what's really in play here is values. What really counts is values. So I started to looking at the evolution of values in society. And this is part of my whole exploration of alternative worldviews and perspectives. I then became disenchanted with values because it turns out that most people think that if your values change, your behavior changes. But what the literature shows is it's the opposite, that you have to force people's behavior to change and their values then conform to the way they are behaving. And we were doing absolutely the opposite in almost every domain of development. So I guess what I'm really saying to you is that I've gone through a sequence of different ways of perceiving the nature of social change, which has made me increasingly disillusioned with the possibility we're going to pull this off. And if you look at that curve of the rising greenhouse gas emissions over a 50-year period of swearing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it gives you a pretty good idea of the direction of my thinking. So I followed that entire train through it all, and getting increasingly disillusioned with the role of science, with the role of intellect, with the role of anything beyond how people actually behave under the influence of the MTI, the modern techno-industrial, delusional conception of human exceptionalism that seems to be driving the show. So I've gotten less and less optimistic over those years and more prone to believe that the biological story is true and that people like Joseph Tainter have really captured it in the most sensitive way, at least from a socio-economic and anthropological point of view.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And Mike, after you will be Lenka. You'll have to choose which question you'll ask first, and I'll put you on the list for later as well, if we get there.
Thank you. First, I'd just like to thank Bill and so many of you for pulling this together and for your wisdom. I'd like to ask before my question, were the press, were environmental NGOs, any government people invited to attend this webinar? And if so, did any come? What was the reaction?
Well, somebody can answer that, not me.
I'll respond to that, seeing as I'm the one who issued all the invitations. We have set lists which include, of course, all previous speakers. We do not go out and specifically target any media. They are certainly allowed to attend as they wish. We've been around for a very long time, and it's not that they are not aware that this series of presentations exists.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I might ask that that you consider some explicit invitations to those groups. Bill, the thought I've had, and you may or may not be looking toward this, is that the best thing we humans can do is to see the writing on the wall and say we ought to go extinct. Thoughts?
There are actually anthropologists who have written books on exactly that topic. David Barra, I can't recall, has written a book called it would be better not to be born. And basically his argument is that the world would be much better off without humans and we should go extinct. So if your concern is the future of nature, don't worry about it. It will long outlive us. It's been said over and over again, the world in 10 million years will be a nice place to live in again, because the ecosphere will recover, but we won't necessarily be part of it. I don't think we're in danger of destroying the planet. We are in danger of destroying prospects for human civilization. You know, we could salvage something here, but if we go down, then it won't be possible for another technologically advanced civilization to emerge, because we will have used and dissipated all of the accessible energy and minerals and so on needed to create such a civilization. So we can preserve, I think, much of what we have gained today, should we get rational about how to deal with these circumstances. But if this civilization crashes through, say, a nuclear holocaust or some other major conflagration, I don't think civilization per se will recover. The species may not go extinct, but the notion of returning to the Stone Age, I suppose, isn't far off the mark. We're certainly not going to live much better than we were early in the, say, 18th century.
Thank you.
And after Lenka, Art Hunter, you have a question.
Hello, Bill. Can you hear me?
Hi, Leica.
Good to see you. Good to see all of you. Hello, Ruben. Thank you very much for having the opportunity to experience this presentation. It's always great. My question is, I was always kind of very puzzled by why we people are not all the same. That being said, why not all of us have so-called cognitive impairment, as you call it, or the obsolescent brains, why some of us, and we have to speak with the utter humility, why some of us may have escaped, to that condition for some reasons. So since I was like 6
I'm
years...
having difficulty hearing you. I don't...
Okay, so since I was like 6 years old, I was trying to find out why I am the way I am and why the others are the other way they are. I was looking, what are those social cultural overrides that enable some people to go the other way than perhaps the majority? Is it, what generally are the conditions? Is it a personal experience? Is it education? You mentioned that you don't think science can really help us to get out of that predicament, and I really agree with you. So is it more like personal experience? Is it connection to nature? Because that's reality outside of our physical existence, or perhaps we are part of that physical existence, but it's much bigger than us. So in your opinion, in your personal opinion, and you already talked about your experience, what the most likely are those social cultural conditions that perhaps could enable more people to escape our impairment?
It's a very, very complex question, as they all are, I guess. Look, there are millions of human beings and a huge amount of variability within the human population. Some of us are natural conformists. Some of us are natural rebels, if you will, nonconformists. And again, natural selection operates on that whole variety of individual types. So the first thing is, right off the top, human beings differ in their capacities and their ability to understand and in their ways of I suppose, responding to whatever they're exposed to. Then there's a huge variety in what we're exposed to. So I mentioned the impact of our silos of educational systems. We don't teach people anything relevant anymore in the sense of trying to tie things together. We're becoming increasingly ignorant by getting more and more specialized in increasingly narrow channels of information. And so we've got an educational system that is just as diverse as the population it's serving, and it creates a double layer of misunderstanding of what's going on in the real world. On top of all of that, we have another neurocognitive problem, and I think this is really important. If you want to get a quick look at it, look for a little book called Brain and Culture. I may have mentioned it in passing, by Bruce Wexler. But Wexler summarizes the information that shows that people, when exposed repeatedly to certain ideas or experiences, will over time develop neural synapses, synaptic circuitry in their brains, which represents a physical representation of that pattern of thinking or those ideas. And that's what indoctrination is all about. Our education system is really a system to indoctrinate people into a particular way and pattern of thinking. Once one has an ideological perspective embedded in your neural circuitry, it acts in two ways. First of all, it causes the individual to seek out experiences in other people that reinforce our pre-existing neural circuitry. So we all attend lectures that we think we're going to be reinforced by attending. Most of us won't go to hear some person we think is, off the wire, so to speak.
So Bill, are you saying that indoctrination, ideology, and identification with something,
yeah, that's what we want. We seek that identification.
A big problem.
Yeah. And at the same time, it blocks out counter information. So once again, you're ideologically entrained and seeking out that confirmation, that, the confirmation bias, you tend to deflect, ignore, or forget contrary information. So you become, in effect, uneducable. And what Wexler and others show is that at that point, the only thing that's going to change your mind is some kind of catastrophic experience, which shows you to completely wrong, or you hit rock bottom. I mean, it's the same experience, I suppose, alcoholics and drug addicts have to confront. You can't really get out of that problem until you've hit rock bottom and come to grips with it in your own mind. I've got a problem. I am going to solve it. So we are, as a culture, in a sense, addicted to a particular way of thinking, which is killing us. And until we, as a culture, hit rock bottom and realize that we have to throw off this intellectual cloak and seek something new, then nothing's going to happen. That's why that curve keeps going upwards. That's why nothing is changing in the domain of geopolitics. We continue to do the same stupid things, and we need a shakeup. And maybe that's what's coming.
Electroshock. One flew over the cuckoo nest.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Art, you're up, and Richard, you'll be next.
Okay, very, very quickly, Bill. Do you consider the indigenous cultures as a model that we should follow as on our pathway from here forward?
Well, again, this is a good question, Art, and again, a very complex one. So there's no question that many indigenous cultures have acquired a way of being in their ecosystems that is relatively benign, where they have a sense of participating consciousness with those systems. But I think there's two other things that have to be kept in mind here. The first is they're generally marginal, small cultures that obey, at least historically, the Dunbar number. I mean, a typical human tribe would be 150 people at most, and you might bump into another few hundred in the course of your lifetime, but that was it. And so under those circumstances, people who were outliers, behavioral outliers, could be ostracized or whatever. There was no hierarchical leadership. A different way of organizing socially becomes possible. That isn't possible when you have, civilizations of tens of millions and even cities of tens of millions. So small tribal size is really important in the establishment of an indigenous identity with each other and with place. But there's another important factor here, and that is that the evidence suggests, it's controversial, but the evidence suggests that indigenous cultures got that way the hard way. So that if you read a book such as, what's a good one to come to mind? The Future Eaters. It's a history of the development of Australian, New Zealand societies over the last 50,000 years. But it follows a line of thought that has been traced elsewhere as well. And that as humans spread over the face of the earth, they eliminated all the flightless birds, the low-hanging fruit, the easily hunted animals. In other words, following this expansionism and tendency to overexploit, the Australasians, in Australia in particular, eliminated the megafauna and the flightless birds. The Maori arrived in New Zealand, as an example, I think around 800. So it's in relatively recent time. It was just a couple of hundred years. They eliminated 12 species of moa forever from the earth simply by overexploiting them. Well, once you've decimated your ecosystem, you go through that boom phase of population, you crash. You now are forced by circumstances to develop a more benign perspective on your way of being on the planet and to live within the remaining carrying capacity of your habitat. So dream time becomes an invention to enable Australian Aboriginals to coordinate themselves with each other and their ecosystem. But again, it's only after they've gone through this process of massive ecosystems alteration. And by the way, there's no reason why humans should feel guilty about this. There's many experiments in biology of what happens when you introduce a large carnivorous animal into an ecosystem. It completely changes the energy and material flows and the species dimensions, species composition of those ecosystems. Humans are no different. You introduce a large mammal like humans that has very large material demands, it is going to massively change that ecosystem. But after a while, the system will settle down and we accommodate to that new system. What evolution didn't count on was the rapid advance of human technology. So that old way of adapting worked when things remain constant for thousands of years. But today, every morning I wake up to some new technology for exploiting the planet and increasing the population and maintaining this and that. And so we're on a roll here, a technological roll that is decimating the home base, and yet we're not cognitively equipped even to recognize that, let alone control it. So yes, they're a good model and they're not a good model. Thank you, Art.
Thank you.
Thank you. And after Richard, Claude, you will be next.
Okay, so thank you. That was a great talk. I have a couple questions for you, Bill. That was a great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Richard,
One thing is, sorry?
Just one question. We're pressed for time.
Yes, okay. So the one thing is, you say our brains are going obsolete, but does that not overlook the role of epigenetics? And for instance, our ability to invent things like renewable energy, which I differ from you in terms of thinking that it will actually change our carbon footprint. But just the role of epigenetics, I think you're overlooking that in terms of the brain becoming obsolete. What do you think of that?
Well, epigenetics is an interesting phenomenon, but it's still genetic. You see, Richard, epigenetics is the term we use when some environmental condition affects which of the genes are turned on or
Exactly.
off.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, there's no evidence that the circumstances in which we are living today is affecting our intellectual capacity to deal with the circumstances we're living with today. So while epigenetics is an important phenomenon and is demonstrated over and over again in different contexts, I don't see it as a major factor in improving our capacity to deal with our current circumstances.
And your thoughts on renewable energy?
Well, look, I think my graph said everything I have to say about it.
Yeah.
Of course, renewable energy exists. Of course, it's going at 15, 20% per year, but it started from a very limited base.
Mhm.
So the actual increment is relatively trivial compared to the increment in the increase in use in fossil fuel. So as far back as I have been recording this, the annual increase in the use of fossil fuel exceeds the annual increase, the increment of new renewable energy. And that graphic that I showed demonstrates not only that, but a second point, and that is that there's no displacement occurring. A new source of energy doesn't necessarily displace previous sources of energy. It simply adds to the total supply, and therefore to our capacity to continue using energy for all the things that we use it for. In fact, I made the point, I think I made the point, I should have if I didn't. Primitive biomass, animal dung, wood, sawdust, that kind of stuff. We're using more of it now than we did in 1800. And we added to that coal, and then came petroleum, then came natural gas, then came nuclear, then came, and now renewable energy. It's additive. It's not substitutative. It's not displacing anything. There is no transition to a new energy supply taking place. What we're
Yet.
doing is adding to
Yet.
the existing
No.
supply.
Well, that's
That's
true.
been the record, and there's no
Yes,
evidence
yes.
we're breaking that record.
Thank you. After Claude will be Charlie Hall.
Thank you so much, Bill. Trying to be very succinct. You astounded me in your interview with Rachel Donald on Planet Critical when you suggested that people read the article and find the article, which is I put in the chat here. The pitchforks are coming, in which you, a scientist, I consider a climate expert, you're the only one that said, you know what, this is going to end in a revolution. How has your feelings and thoughts on this changed, if any, in the subsequent, I think, year or half a year?
Sorry, can you explain, why did you think I was, what
Well,
surprised you?
Well, it surprised me because most people, it's a taboo subject. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, so I read a lot of articles, a lot of conversations, sometimes in the weekends where, come the revolution, almost as a joke. But what you're saying is that sooner or later, people will not tolerate this. When they're starving to death, some very strange things are going to happen. And I was wondering, you see things from like a 40,000-foot view. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, which I don't think Rachel Donald wanted to do on her program.
No, I have a great deal of respect for her, but she's excessively optimistic, shall we say. Look, somebody once said, it's been attributed to a dozen different people, but something like civilization is 3 square miles away from anarchy. Okay. So it seems to me that what is likely to happen in the next few decades is increasing difficulty in provisioning major cities with basics such as food. And when that happens, people will be forced to think through the nature of our dilemma. I mean, a city like Shanghai, with 30 million people, Tokyo, the population of Canada, virtually in one place. It's well supplied and provisioned because we have a fossil fuel powered food production system and a fossil fuel powered provisioning system based on kerosene powered aircraft and bunker C powered shipping that can provide a city and a country like Japan. But when that breaks down, all hell breaks loose because people will be cut off from their basics. And it'll be worsened by the fact that we're seeing increasing control over limited resources going to fewer and fewer people. This is the rise of the billionaire oligarchs. Look what's happening in the States. Charlie may give us some insights into how he's feeling about that. But you know that chart that I put up on the rising CO2 emissions? Did I mention that I tried to update it? That site is closed down. So
Yes, I put that link so that other people who read the chat, the YouTube audience, can also, hopefully when they use it, it'll work. But
Okay.
I've been sharing that link because I think that tells the story.
It does. So I think it's possible that in the United States, even the people who voted for Trump are going to find that they are badly abused by the kinds of policies that he's putting in. And at some point, you know, there's been, if you follow, as I'm sure you do, many of these discussions, there's open discussion of revolution in the United States, a second US revolution, no matter who wins the election. If the Democrats had won, the Trump faction would have gone berserk. The Trump faction won, but now they're wreaking havoc with the US. You know, it's just been the last 2 days that I've seen people openly discussing, online at least, that we're seeing an effective coup having happened in the United States. That it's a takeover of the implements of the institutions of governance by a relatively unelected few to the detriment of the vast majority. And if that happens, then the pitchforks will have arrived much more rapidly than I think anybody anticipated a little while ago. Yeah, so a collapse through revolution is one of the ways that Tainter's talks about, as have others. I shouldn't keep emphasizing Tainter. There's been many books of that kind. So yeah, thanks. That's a good question, Claude.
Thank you so much.
And Charlie, you will have the privilege of the last comment or question. And just a reminder to everyone else who wishes to hang around, if certainly it's the case that anyone who wishes to stay on after we turn off the tape to engage in conversation, our hope is that Bill will hang around for a while and that we can have at it. So this is not the end of the conversation, it's just the end of the formal part of this session. Charlie, to you.
I have just come from a different peak oil group conversation, and it's been extremely impactful to me. We had Art Berman come and give his perspective on oil. And anybody who wants to find out what it is, his last two presentations on his website, just go to Art Berman and Berman. But anyway, I spent most of my life under the impression that this madness, all of which I agree with, basically with what Bill's saying in lots of details, would be limited by peak oil. But Art is making, and I have spent a lot of my life as a scientist trying to evaluate what peak oil will be, when and how much, and that kind of thing. And he gave a perspective from the financial community, which is quite different, which is we'll get it. As long as we can make 10%, we'll get oil. And he believes in peak oil, but not anything like as soon as I have actually published on. And this is very unsettling to me, because what's to limit the craziness if the oil continues? The only thing worse, I've often said, the only thing worse than running out of oil is not running out of oil. Well, I think we're going to be not running out of oil if Art is right, and I'm dealing with the other people in my life, John Lehrer and Roger Bentley and so forth, trying to figure out whether he can possibly be right. But he might be a person, Ruben, that you might think about inviting. It's a very unsettling talk, but he gives it in very smooth, even, rational way. And one thing we have to consider is what happens if there are not limits on this madness within the next generation.
And what does that mean? And, climate change, I don't see that as limiting the machine. Yeah, I mean, people will suffer and in various areas will be impacted, but peak oil I saw is something that could limit the machine. And social upheaval, of course, which I agree with you, is very likely. I don't know. And peak oil is occurring in something like 38 or 45 oil producing countries, but the ones that are left are big and have a lot of oil. In Canada is running out of conventional oil, but it doesn't matter because you're going after the tar sands. And I suspect independent of what any Canadian says, you're just going to do it. And that's basically, I think, the position of Art Berman. So what are the limits to growth? What if there are not growth? How about that for a new book? No limits to growth.
Well, Charlie, it's really great to hear from you again. And you and I have been sparring on these questions for how many decades now? I have seen the Berman presentation. I think it's well worth looking at. I agree with them. That was my second, if you remember, I had my two dilemmas. We either give up oil or we don't. And I said that the default position is that we'll keep using it as long as it's economically feasible. And what Art is arguing is that, look, as the price rises, this is the old economics argument. It always has been. With price increases, it stimulates human ingenuity. We'll find more ways of tapping into the oil that remains, and we will get it out. And as I say, it ties into that human predisposition to use up all available resources as long as we can. But what we're doing in the process is the climate change thing. We're diminishing the ecosphere in terms of, 70% of vertebrate species populations have disappeared in just the last 50 years. Fisheries are going down. I read this morning that you've got a teaspoon worth of plastic particles in your brain, which are beginning to inhibit your thought process. Not you specifically, Charlie, but you may be better off. But the point is, so that is a real possibility. On the other hand, do you know Adam Rosenzweig? He gave a presentation with Chris Martenson just today or yesterday, recently, in which he makes the case that we've reached peak oil in the shales. So it's a different perspective than Art Berman's. So this is not a settled question by any means.
Oh, absolutely.
I think Art has a good hang on the fact that there's lots of other deposits of shale elsewhere in the world that haven't been exploited. And if that's the case, okay, let me put this in a very succinct way if I can. Something like 5 billion people are now energy insecure. They want to live like us. And the only way they can do that, with apologies to those of you who think alternative energy or green energy is going to do it, the only way 4 billion or 5 billion more people can reach even Western European material standards is through the use of fossil fuels. This will happen. And if that happens, it's absolute climate chaos. Just today, or yesterday, again, these things have come at us so rapidly, it's hard to even remember. Hansen and his group have published a new paper saying that 2 degrees warming is already in the rear view mirror. We're headed for a doubling of CO2, and that is climate catastrophe bar none. Even with 2 degrees, something like 2 billion human beings will be displaced from their climate niche. In other words, the domain of climate that human beings have evolved to be adapted to. And so with 2 degrees of warming, there will be mass migrations and a breakdown of geopolitics, in my view. We simply won't tolerate that kind of thing. Look what your country is doing with respect to a few hundred migrants a day coming up from your good friends to the south in Mexico and Latin America. So we are in for a world of increasing turmoil as the result of ecological destruction and climate change going hand in hand to displace countless millions of people from previously habitable landscapes. They will not be resisted. These are the pitchforks that somebody else asked about it just a moment ago. The pitchforks are coming. Get used to it or get a gun. That's what's going to happen, unfortunately.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you all. I'll turn this over to Ted Manning, the chair of the board of CACOR and a Canadian member of the Club of Rome. So Ted, it is yours.
Bill, you are always very difficult to follow. And one thing I have learned, it's time to go out in the backyard and start sharpening my pitchfork. The first time I met you was at the Globe 90 conference when you won the prize for presenting best person at the session, and where you introduced to an awful lot of us in Canada the whole notion of ecological footprint, which, by the way, is very important. It has been usable by many of us to try and convince people that they actually did relate to their planet and that they're not just a consumer. That is really some of the PR that we are continuously trying to fight and to get to happen. So I will like to say this is one of several times I've heard you speak, and every time I learn something, and every time I go away impressed and say, I'm going to invite him back again soon. And I think most of us agree that that's the case. So I will thank you specifically for helping us so frequently to try and make a real difference. We are also going to ask those of you who may not have joined us to join us. One of the questions I got in the chat was essentially, what are CACOR's goals? Is this just a weekly social club? And in some ways it is, but this is about one of 5 things we do. And for people who are seriously interested, go on to the CACOR website. You can see exactly what our goals and aspirations are, and see what some of the other programs we are doing, including chat rooms and various things. Our objective is to try and make a difference, inspired by people like Bill and others who we are working with and talking to all the time. So once again, please join us if you are not joined already. If you have not paid your dues, please do so, because we have to pay to keep this on the air. And for those of you who wish to share it, all of the presentations, over 230 of them now, are on our website, and they are also, somebody says to me, sorry, we're no longer on X. Maybe we've been thrown off. I have no idea. The one good news, by the way, if you do go on to your own website, NOAA still exists. I can still get the weather there. I just can't get anything on the actual readings from the top of Mauna Loa. So anyway, have a great day, and we'll see you again in a week. And we are now going to let this be turned off so we can speak to each other, so that nobody who shouldn't hear what we have to say is able to do so.